And when we were thinking kind of back in the summer, what could we have as a theme this year? I think we were just struck by what was on the news at the time, which were rallies in London where crosses were being held up, and there were sort of cries to bring back Christianity and Britain to its Christian roots. And of course, those images provoked lots of questions and lots of thoughts. What does it mean for our country to be Christian? What is the influence of Christianity on our country? What have we seen Jesus do in terms of shaping our nation? And so, without kind of having any sense of values on those rallies and what we thought about them, we wanted to ask some questions in Lent this year about Christianity in Britain, and to look at some of the heroes of our faith, and to explore how Christ had used those people to bring his love and his values and the things which really are important to Jesus, to our culture. And so I'm sort of excited that we've got 4 different speakers who are going to speak from a perspective of starting with somebody who's had a real influence in shaping our country. What did we learn from them? And actually, what does that mean particularly for us today? What does it mean to be a Christian today in the world that we live in, which feels like an ever more complex and kind of polarized world? So that's what we're hoping to do. And so I'm really excited that we've got the speakers that we have. And I'm going to ask Jo to come and introduce Jenny, our speaker tonight. Jo, when I said this is what we'd love to do, she said, I've got just the person who will be great. And so Jo, will you come and tell me why you thought it'd be great to have Jenny with us here tonight?
Good evening, everyone. I work with Jenny. Jenny's my boss. So I have to say really nice things about her. Jenny is the founder of a small national charity called Together for the Common Good. That's who I work for. She will share with you some of the roots of that charity, where the stories, where that came from, the people that have influenced her in her thoughts and life. She joins us tonight after quite a heavy work day. We've had an away day. Jenny's based in Liverpool, so she's made the trip across to be with us this evening. And she doesn't know this, but when I describe Jenny to people, I say that she's possibly the most inspiring woman that I know. So I am delighted to warmly welcome Jenny to speak to us this evening.
Hi everyone, please bear with me, I'm getting over a hip replacement, so I'm sure some of you will sympathise with that if you've been through it yourself. It's really lovely to be here. What a lovely place. It's so cosy and convivial and lovely lighting and really nice to meet people beforehand. I'm just going to make sure I've got a timer on here. Right, so I think this evening's title is From the Sheppard Worlock Story to the Catholic Social Tradition, and the subtitle is Christian Witness in the Unravelling. I think we're all beginning to see that things are unravelling. It is pretty serious what's going on. So that's the sort of backdrop. So I'm going to introduce you to a bit of that story, the Sheppard Worlock story. I'm David Sheppard's daughter. Now, when I was a teenager, the language world that I lived in was the church, justice, gospel, poverty, politics. That was the currency of our kitchen table. But I wasn't happy being a bishop's daughter. I really didn't like it. I was a bit of a rebel. I preferred Liverpool's music scene. And if there are any teachers here tonight, I was one of the people you were worried about. And I became estranged from the church. I left home in 1980. I drifted. And then in my mid-20s, I experienced a dark night of the soul. And an unexpected grace. I had a conversion experience. And to everyone's surprise, I was drawn to the Catholic Church. Of course, I'd grown up in an Anglican family, a very prominent, high media profile Anglican family. So that was quite a big deal. I married, I had children, I lived a quiet life. Then over 20 years later, in my mid-40s, in 2011, I felt what I now know, didn't know then, was a nudge of the Holy Spirit. And my life was about to change. And I was sensing things around me in the country that weren't right. I think probably the seeds of what we see now really showing. And I felt that the politics of both left and right were failing, and the churches were unable to respond adequately to what was going on. You might remember the Tottenham riots around that time. There was 3 years after the banking crash. Anyway, I had quite a strong, faithful prayer life by that time. I was just working as a graphic designer. I wasn't doing anything special. I'd done a really bad degree at Goldsmiths. I wasn't pursuing a career particularly. But I prayed and I felt God was calling me. And I felt a trail was being set for me. You need to meet this person, you need to meet that person. And I'm going to tell you a story in a moment about a partnership that my father was involved with. And that was a very big influence at that time, and I felt drawn to look at their partnership. And so let me take you back to when I was 13, 1975. And we moved from London to Liverpool. My dad was made Bishop of Liverpool. And as some of you might realise, Liverpool at that time was a really troubled city. High unemployment, sectarianism, big history of sectarianism, no-go areas, very dysfunctional local government leadership, divided, unstable, seen as a bit of a basket case, really. And so we were sent there, and interestingly, within 6 months of our arrival, the Catholic Archbishop was appointed too. So you had two bishops from the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church arriving within 6 months of each other. And neither of them had had any ecumenical experience before. Remember, this is pre-Churches Together England. This is pre all that ecumenical spring, which happened in the 80s. And they had only met once briefly some years before. They didn't really know each other. And what happened was my dad, we'd arrived first, and he decided that he had to go and meet his opposite number. So he went round to the Archbishop's house, rang the doorbell, standing there on the step holding a bottle of wine, and just said, I thought I'd come and say hello. So that was the beginning of an extraordinary friendship, which has become, quite well known among people in the churches, at least. And they saw themselves as brothers in Christ, and they felt that they had really humbly been called at that moment to the city and somehow needed to step into a leadership role, joint leadership role. And of course, over time, their partnership extended to Baptist, Methodist, URC, Salvation Army, Free Church partners too. But I'm talking about their friendship tonight. They were close friends. In time, they went on holiday together. They spoke on the phone pretty much every day for 20 years. They prayed together. They never broke any rules, never took communion together. They started quite early on acting in the civic space together. One of the earliest things they did was they were approached by some local people who had spotted a piece of land where a Tate and Lyle factory used to be, and these people were being faced with eviction and moved out of the city. And they said, we don't want to move out, we want to stay together, and that piece of land there, we want to live there. They wanted to build a village. So, it's a long story I won't tell, but it ended up being the Eldonians Housing Association. And so the bishop's role in that was not to lead on it, but to support local people's desire and to help it along the way. So that was one example of a local institution that they helped build. They also championed the union of Catholic and Anglican teacher training colleges, which were under threat of closure. And over many years, they managed to assemble them together into what became Liverpool Hope University. So there's a bit of a theme starting there, that they are not just church leaders in churches and cathedrals, they're acting in the city. And of course, then you probably remember, some of you will remember the 1981 riots. There was serious social unrest between the black community and the police. Now, by this time, both bishops had very much established a culture within their clergy of being very close to the communities, very, very strong listening practice, a sense of solidarity with communities. And so they already knew the people on the ground. So when this happened, they were in an interesting position because they had also forged relationships with the police and civic leaders. So they were in a unique position of being able to mediate between this great tension. So that's another example of the kind of leadership that we're talking about. Then moving forward, that was about 1970, that was at 1981, and around about the same year, in fact, we're getting this happening all over the country, but this rising unemployment, and of course we're in the middle of the Thatcher years now. And you might remember that moment when Norman Tebbit said, I think it was at a Conservative Party conference, people should get on their bike and go and look for work. Now, that seemed quite an affront at the time, because it seemed to be kind of the norm that you would stay home and you would get a local job. We're going to see a bit later on this evening how that's changed, but that was the moment that it started to change. So the bishops also really cared about communities and families, and they know that jobs are absolutely at the heart of the flourishing of a family and a community. So they began to be aware of the context in which they're operating. Can't help but become drawn into the civic life, the politics of a place, because that's what God cares about too, right? And in the year after the riots, they recognised that there was a real problem with a sense of agency among the black community. So they helped to establish the Liverpool Law Centre, which not only helped the local black community access legal advice, but also sets some people on the road to becoming lawyers. So again, you get this another theme, this back to the local institutions theme, strengthening the city. Now, by this time, their relationship had really bedded down. It was really, a daily relationship. They'd be on the phone together, they'd be responding to media calls together, they would do joint statements. I don't mean like a sort of dry printed joint statement that churches together print, which I find a bit, a bit weak nowadays, to be honest with you. But in those days, they'd be responding very directly to questions, and they would be on the media quite regularly. They were quite vocal about challenging the government policies of the time. They got a bit of a reputation for being a bit sort of firebrand. But their indignation came from their care for families and communities and what was happening to human beings. Now, by this time, sort of late 81, Derek Worlock, who I got to know later on in life, he was a very gifted diplomat, having been the private secretary to 3 cardinals and a lot of international dealings. He was a very canny operator. I would say he was politically much more astute than my father. My father had the sort of common touch in the media talent. Between them, they were an exceptional combination. But Derek had been very good friends with one Karl Wojtyla, who had become John Paul II. And he wrote to him in 1981 and said, "There's something happening here. Will you come and visit us?" Something happening, what he meant was, up until that point, the Catholic Church in England had still been in a sort of siege mentality, a sort of recusant history, a hangover from that past. And for the first time, Derek was saying things are changing. Because what was happening was, my father was saying to Derek, "You've got a gift that we all need. You need to be outward facing and share it with the whole country, not just serve your own." Now, this was a departure. So it was a genuine partnership. There was no leading figure. It was an equal partnership. And so John Paul II wrote back and said, "Yes, I'll come." Now, this was the first visit of a reigning pope since the Reformation. This is a historic moment. Now we take it for granted. We see the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury kneeling next to each other, but it's never happened before since the Reformation. So because of the Falklands War, it was very difficult diplomatically, but Derek knew how to fix this sort of thing. So there was negotiations with the South American bishops and so on and so forth, and that's why it was a pastoral visit and not a state visit. And of course, you then see Robert Runcie and John Paul II kneeling together before the tomb of St. Edward the Confessor, and thereafter this joint public witness became the norm. And then after that, you get the ecumenical spring and the ecumenical instruments start to emerge. So that's sort of, I don't usually use the word ecumenical now. I find it a really boring word, but people use unity, that's fine. But that's the sort of technical term for what was happening. So it was a big part of what they were consciously doing. They knew what they were doing. They knew how significant this was. And in fact, when they first met and people recognized they were getting to be friends, there were people who warned them, "Don't do this. Don't do this joint witness. You don't know what a can of worms this is. You're going to open up dangerous things." Because Liverpool was close to becoming another Belfast. But they ignored that advice, of course, and they just went ahead anyway. And over time, their joint leadership, this dynamic of standing side by side, it really works. Because if you're standing side by side with someone who has different interests, you can't possibly be advocating for your own. And the city saw that, and the city responded. They became objects of affection by ordinary people in the city. Because they would say, a taxi driver would say, for example, "Oh yes, they were for us." They didn't perceive the church leaders as, on a marketing exercise to try and get bums on seats into the church. They saw the church there acting for the city. So we're getting a bit further forward now, mid-80s, and we're talking about the miners' strike. Okay, we're getting the beginning of deindustrialisation. And there's obviously a lot of tension and so on. And David and Derek see the impact on miners' families. They get involved with this. They advocate for striking miners. But they do so in a way that they try not to be explicitly partisan, but they're saying we care about the livelihoods of families. And of course, now we're getting into the territory of thinking, if you can remember the report, Faith in the City, that's now in the pipeline as well. So my father had published the book Bias to the Poor in 1982, and that had been a huge influence on the Church of England starting the Faith in the City research and reports, which was published in 85. And of course, this caused a lot of rumpus because, again, Norman Tebbit called it Marxist and so on. It's got more publicity as a result. And it had lots of recommendations for government, but also recommendations for the church. And it kind of instigated a sort of new energy into Christian social action. But there were other things going on alongside this. People say in the press they were seen as the red bishops or left-wing firebrands. But what people didn't realise was behind the scenes they were doing other things too. So in 1984 they started what they called the Michaelmas Group, which was a group they co-chaired of all the major business employers in the region. So from ocean trading to Fords at Hellwood. a group of 12 men who met privately, Chatham House rule, every 6 weeks for 13 years. Now, I was very surprised how long they met for. I thought it was probably just a year or two, but actually it went on a whole period. And what this did was it provided a private space for people who were at the top of their game, but who potentially, in many cases, were being pressured by their HQ, maybe in Frankfurt or where else. Why are you still in that basket case of a city? It's time to pull out. You remember, this is the time of capital flight, this deindustrializing period. It's where investment's being pulled out and it's going to the Far East. So that group, it's hard to prove a negative, but you imagine perhaps the damage would have been a lot worse had they not been meeting, because the people in that group were, most of them were Christian, and they were able to share privately the pressures they were under, but also to say, we understand the importance of jobs for families and communities, and we're committed to this city. We will do everything we can to stay, to keep the investment here. So I think that's a really interesting sort of counter to the public image of the bishops. So they worked with business. They also marched with unions for jobs. You know, it's a both and. It's a both and approach. Also, you might remember in 1985, the militant tendency. So that's sort of equivalent of our hard progressive left now, who were deliberately bankrupted the council and were very, very extreme. And they expected the bishops to side with them, but the bishops wouldn't. So they upset the right and the left. They kept their own council. They published a book together, Better Together, in 1988. They appeared on Wogan Live together. They were often called fish and chips, always together and always in the papers. They were held in great affection, as I say. And there were moments of terrible tragedy, of course, the Hillsborough disaster in '89, when the whole city was in terrible mourning. 90-odd people were killed. And the way that they responded was they held a civic mass in the Catholic cathedral, packed to the doors, thousands of people turned up. And both David and Derek processed in together and held the mass together. And also they did a similar service in Anfield. So we're in an era where the church leaders in Liverpool were very welcome. They were seen as part of the civic infrastructure, if you like. So then we get into the 90s, a sort of consolidation of their partnership. So they're advocating for the city, they're making these joint statements, they're doing joint talks, a lot of community action. And the city is no longer divided by sectarianism. They awarded the joint Freedom of the City of Liverpool in 1994. I think we would probably regard them as servant leaders. They tried not to be too top down. We might see that slightly differently now. I think there's a certain patrician element to it from a modern perspective. Derek died in 1996. My father retired in 1997 and died in 2005. And in 2008, they were honoured with a statue in Hope Street between the two cathedrals. And their motto was, do everything together except the things which conscience forces us to do apart. So that's a kind of standard motto for ecumenical working. So let's just shift now. I want to give you another example of joint Christian leadership at a time of crisis. I'm going to take you back to 1889 in East London in the Great Dock Strike. Now, William Booth, the founder of Salvation Army, who'd been an English Methodist preacher, he and his wife Catherine had gone to the East End and given up the settled ministry of Methodism, disillusioned by the traditional limitations, and they wanted to work among slum dwellers. And so they had this soup, soap and salvation ministry to the poor. They knew their people very well. At the same time, there was Cardinal Manning, the Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, who too had changed denomination. He previously had been an Anglican, ordained Anglican, and had been married. He was widowed, tragically, after only 4 years. And then he became disillusioned over matters of doctrine, left the Anglican Church and became a Catholic, became the Archbishop of Westminster, and then a cardinal. So you had Manning and Booth, and they knew each other. The point I'm making is they both knew their people. They were close to families. They knew about poverty. They understood as well what was happening at this critical point. So with 1889, we're talking about, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing now. So they're seeing firsthand, on the docks, the effects of unrestrained capital on human beings, where every day thousands of men turn up on the quayside, half would get work, half wouldn't, and their families starved. This was the reality. And in 1889, there was a dispute over pay that led to a great strike. It spread to over 100,000 workers across the port of London. Now, Manning, it turns out, was the son of a banker, so he had no illusions about how unrestrained capital can behave. And he was invited to act as honest broker, trusted by both sides, and he mediated and helped to settle the dispute, and his intervention was known as the Cardinal's Peace. And interestingly, this leads us to the beginning of Catholic social teaching, because what he's doing at this point is he's feeding back to the Vatican what he's seeing happening on the ground. And he's saying, we're seeing human beings being subordinated to the interests of big money. And of course, because the Catholic Church is global, they're getting this information coming from all over the world. So they're seeing a pattern emerge. And around that time, Leo XIII was the Pope at the time, and he ends up publishing a document, a seminal historic document called Rerum Novarum, which means of new things. And the new thing was industry. It was this industrial revolution and its effects on the human being. And that was the first of the series of documents that's now known as Catholic social teaching. And really what it does is it examines in detail what happens to human beings in this kind of scenario, from a deeply theological position, gospel interpretation of what this new economic system is doing. So since then, the Church has continued to respond directly to the great social changes of our times. Of course, 1891 isn't the beginning of Catholic teaching. You're going right back to Augustine, Aquinas, and so on, or the ancient fathers, but this is the modern era. This is the beginning of the modern era. And in the subsequent years, the documents that are published are also cover every aspect of human life, from family to just war, from conscience to love of neighbour, from the natural world to science and technology, missionary discipleship, political economy, euthanasia, the excesses of capitalism and the tyranny of communism, from social peace to civil rights, from local associations to the dignity of work. Everything is covered, depending on what the issue of the day is. And this year is the 135th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, and we are expecting our new Pope, who is also called himself Leo for a very particular reason, because he's linking himself with that tradition. So he's Leo XIV. He will be publishing a new Catholic social teaching document, what we call an encyclical, probably this May, and we think it's going to be on AI and the future of work. So this is the new thing. We are now on the brink of a new industrial revolution, and so it's really important for those of us who are Christians who care about the human being, because we're made in the image of God and God cares about human beings, what this revolution is going to do to the human being. It's our business. So I just want to take a moment to look very briefly at some of the principles that are like themes that run through this tradition. You'll know, human dignity is the key principle. And what this tradition does is it trains us to look at any system and what it does to human beings. It trains us to critique systems that dehumanize. It trains us to praise systems that rehumanize and enable the flourishing of the human being. And from human dignity, what flows from that is we get the dignity of work, we get respect for life. These are the things that flow from it. We get equality in the eyes of God. Not equal. We're not equal. We're not meant to be equal. We're meant to be complementary, but we are equal in the eyes of God. Then the principle of solidarity, which again keeps coming up a lot, and it trains us to think about whose side we're on, and a dedicated effort to see that we are each other's brother's keeper. And then the principle of subsidiarity, it's a tricky word, but it's a really important principle. And it basically trains us to think about agency, the integrity of the person, about responsibility being taken at the appropriate level. And it holds that decisions should be taken closest to those they affect, and decisions should not be taken by a high authority that can be taken lower down. So if you think about, the structure of a country or a family or a school, for example, that helps us to think about how you prevent the problem of de-skilling, how you prevent somebody losing agency because someone's doing something for them. Then another of the key themes in Catholic social teaching is intermediary institutions. So this idea of society, the state, the market, the human being, the family, but in the middle, there's this layer of what we call intermediary institutions. So that's like businesses, clubs, associations, charities, all those kind of human-sized institutions that we learn, through which we learn how to be human. Now, in a healthy society, you'll have, or in a healthy neighbourhood, you'll have cafes, restaurants, boutiques, tenants associations, fishing club, a book club. There'll be lots of healthy things like that. But in a poor neighbourhood, you might just have a chicken shop and a betting shop. And that's a very thin layer. And that means that life is too harsh because there's nothing between the person and the state, right? Life is too harsh, and they don't have the opportunity to learn how to take responsibility, how to be social, how to interact, and so on. So this layer of institutions is very important. So we can just think back, loop back to the Liverpool 8 Law Centre, the Eldonians Housing Association, Liverpool Hope University. These are institutions that are important. Another principle we've just mentioned, the dignity of work, which is this theme that is running through everything so far tonight. Dignity of work is so important because work is much more than a way of making a living. It's how we contribute to God's great creative participation. Decent work, decent pay. And this is going to become a massive issue as the AI revolution takes hold. It's going to change everything so much. It's hard for us to predict. And the danger is that we're going to end up in a sort of dystopian future of, universal basic income where most people are on a kind of subsistence level and only privileged people can work. So we've got to be really careful about understanding what elements of work can be outsourced to AI and robotics and what elements should remain human. Then, of course, one of the biggest principles in Catholic social teaching is the option for the poor. Now, the reason this is here, it's not just because it's nice to be nice to poor people. It's not just because they lack material goods and they need something. There's something deeper going on here. So Pope Francis and some of the Latin American bishops back in 2007, they said that the poor have an awareness of each other, the awareness of the need for other people, an awareness of God that the affluent and the busy often lose. The affluent and the busy tend to get sucked into an individualistic lifestyle, an indifference. The poor tend to have a sense of need for the other. And so that's part of the reason that it's important for the church to have the poor at the heart of the church. And it's also why decisions should be taken with the poor at the heart of the decision. If you don't have that option for the poor in the middle, you'll come to the wrong decision. If you think of making decisions for the country and you ignore the poor, you're going to come to the wrong decision. It's like the Corinthians, members of one body image. If you overlook that vulnerable part, you're going to make a mistake, and the whole body can suffer. And then finally, I just want to say about the principle of the common good, which is central in Catholic social teaching. And really, this is often misunderstood. People think it's a bit woolly, like it's just a medicine you ought to take, or it's some sort of vague meaning about social justice. It's not really like that. It's about a shared life. It's about how we live together. We all contribute voluntarily, without coercion. And it's about that very precious moment between human beings. For example, think of a choir. Think it could be a pretty ropey choir, but all the voices together make a beautiful sound, and everybody thrives through it. So it's about that precious moment of human being together that allows everyone to thrive. So I think we can see that from the 1800s, the principles informing Manning and Booth's response involved the dignity of the person, involved the dignity of work. Capital must never subordinate labour, the importance of the family, solidarity with the poor. And again, in the 70s, 80s and 90s, with the Sheppard Worlock partnership, we can see they also focused on dignity of work, solidarity with poor communities, the flourishing of family life, subsidiarity enabling the agency of local communities. So for 22 years, their focus was like that. And we could say they worked together for the common good, though they never actually used that phrase. And we could also describe this as an example of civic friendship, indeed a kind of spiritual partnership. And those contexts are kind of familiar to us today, aren't they? Dysfunctional government, polarised extremist politics, discontent, sectarianism. They were, however, and I would say it's a bit of a but here, I don't think we should pull their legacy forward wholesale, because this is a new time. It was of its time. If I was to critique them, I would say they were too trusting in the state as the source of solution. They were partisan. They sided very much with the Labour Party. They didn't understand the true nature of the neoliberal project, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, which was later to wreak such terrible damage over our country. And I think there's a certain element of the patrician, our sense of care for the poor. In fact, my father's biography is called Batting for the Poor. Many of you will know he was a cricketer before he was in the church, but that idea of not batting with, but batting for, it gives you a certain sense of the tone of, we know how to help, but actually now I think the dynamics are different. So bringing up to date, this is a new time, and I think it was Hemingway who said something like, change happens slowly and then all at once. And it feels like that, doesn't it? And Pope Francis said, a good 10 years ago now, he said, this is not just an era of change, but a change of era. He said, we're going through a process of being stripped of false securities, where it's no longer possible to complacently enjoy the illusions of the old era. It's not credible anymore to continue with the assumption that governments can adequately represent us, or that the socio-economic model we've been living with can underwrite a flourishing life for all. This is a new time. So what do we see now? We see extremes of inequality. We see estrangement between civic groups. We see commodification of creation, war, displacement of people, hyper-liberalisation of things like abortion, assisted suicide, a huge shift in an understanding of human dignity. We see proliferation of social media exploiting the young. We see the the local being subordinated by the digital world. We see the acceleration of AI and the technocratic paradigm. We're beginning to see the collapse of trust in institutions. There's tribalism. We're also seeing huge amount of loneliness, especially among the young. The statistics show that loneliness is much worse among the young than the old. And we're seeing a sense of nihilism and distress about meaninglessness. And I think perhaps if I was saying this 10 years ago, and people were saying, "Are you exaggerating a bit? It's a bit over the top. It's a bit catastrophizing." But I think now we can see actually that this is happening. Notwithstanding the fact that healthy, normal life goes on, but it depends where you live. It depends where you live, who you know, and what media you consume. We've become so fragmented now that our lives are in parallel. But I want to say something about why this has happened. What has happened over the last 40 years that Sheppard and Worlock were only just beginning to sense? And I would just want to say that every era is shaped by an animating idea. And the idea underpinning the era that's in the process of breaking down comes from the philosophy of liberalism, but a particularly extreme strain of liberalism stemming from the idea of the unencumbered self, where freedom is understood as freedom from constraint. So freedom from the constraint of family, freedom from the constraint of borders, freedom from history, freedom from God, freedom from natural law. This is where we are now. This is why you get to the point of people saying, "Oh, it's perfectly all right to have abortion up to birth." This is why you get people saying, "It's got nothing to do with you if I choose to kill myself. It's not going to affect you." I mean, obviously this is nonsense, right? If someone takes an action, it's going to have effects on everybody around them, everyone that cares for them, everyone they're in a relationship with. So it's actually denying reality. But this is where we got to. Now, this ideology is inherently unstable because it relies on a false anthropology. It's a desiccated, soulless conception of the human being, which generates this false idea of freedom. And it leads to this cult of self, the I this, the I that. Everything's about my personal preferences. The whole culture has been affected with this idea of choice. It's not really choice. And this false anthropology is so completely unlike a Christian anthropology, where the person is a relational being made in the image of God. And this philosophy, of course, therefore goes against the grain of humanity. And it eventually, inevitably, liberates society from truth and from mutual responsibility. Its spirit is anti-human, and that's why the system is breaking down. That's why we see the unravelling. It's based on a relativistic and a materialistic logic that ultimately brings about its own destruction. Of course, it's not just this country, it's every country in the world, mainly Western countries, that have adopted this particular system. And it did take hold in 1979. It has roots back in the Enlightenment, but it particularly went on steroids from 1979. So this misconception of the human being as an isolated, sort of rights-bearing, competitive individual, it's also led to the emergence of identitarian politics. So this is why we get these distorted forms of victimhood and the culture wars. And it's led to a spiritual confusion and a demoralization. It's also distorted the meaning of social justice. The conception that's now dominant is focused upon identity and the oppressor-oppressed dynamic. This is not the definition of justice from a Christian point of view. Christian justice is about relational justice. It's about right relationship. That's where it goes right back in the Old Testament. The rabbinical tradition of justice is about right relationship, not about division. So this animating idea eats away at shared values, and it's eroded our sense of citizenship. It dissolves relationship. It undermines the particularity of place. So we can see it's had a huge impact on the economy. It broke the tradition of vocational jobs. We offshored all our jobs to the Far East. All the investment went abroad. It was then replaced with the idea of, the knowledge economy, the service economy. The whole thing was to make a frictionless environment for investors. It worked very well for them, but it's been devastating for some of our communities. And it also sucked workers from poor countries away from their families to come and work for Western business models here on very low wages. So the whole thing created a low-wage economy. Wages too low to live on, by the way, which is why we now have 9 million people on universal credit. That's up from 7.5 million last year. This is completely outrageous. You know, from a Christian point of view, it's an affront to human dignity, not only that people are poor, but that they're without work. And we've created a culture of entitlement. So this breaking relationship with place has been quite devastating. We referred to the Norman Tebbit moment 40 years ago, where he's saying, get on your bike, and that felt like that was a really right-wing thing to say. But now it's freedom. It's been rebranded. So the idea of movement is now supposed to be freedom. Now, of course, the reason this is happening is because it's in the interests of the globalization dogma, which is in the interests of big business. So you can see what I'm saying is coming from a tradition. I'm coming from this Catholic social teaching tradition, which is saying, what is happening to human beings? What's happening to families? What's happening to communities? Are they thriving? Answer no. Why is it? It's because the economy is structured in this way. And I would describe this whole state of affairs as a breach of the common good. Because communities that suffered at the hands of this globalization dogma, they've not only been left behind, they don't just feel left behind, it's a fact, but there's been no correction. There's been no further investment, there hasn't been retraining, it just hasn't been done. And on top of that, they're then framed as deficient and backward. So we shouldn't be surprised to now see this politics of discontent. And the impact on our common life has been quite devastating. We've got a breakdown of trust now. Huge, huge problem now manifesting in our politics. It's affected both the left and the right. Both our main political parties were completely colonised by this liberal idea. Conservatives stopped conserving, Labour stopped advocating for Labour, completely changed their priorities. And there's a kind of mutual blind spot going on, which still persists. To the right, attribute all the moral unravelling to excessive liberalism, but somehow the neoliberal economic system gets a free pass. Meanwhile, the left attribute poverty to the neoliberal economic system, but they embrace the progressive ideas of unlimited self-actualisation. For example, in terms of gender, I can remake my own body as if I'm God. So both the left and the right at the moment are still captured by this hyperliberalism. Now, I think we ought to broach the difficult subject of how this 40 years of this system has impacted the churches. Now, there are lots of angles we could take here, but we haven't got time to go into all of them. But let's in particular look at the relationship of the churches with poor communities. What's happened? So we could formulate this into 3 sins. That would be one way of looking at it. I would formulate that as the disconnect between charity and justice. In other words, continuing to hand out food parcels whilst not challenging the economic system that creates poverty in the first place. Inadvertently, through great well-meaning and kindness, actually being part of the problem, popping up the system, falling for the wrong kind of justice, falling for a welfarist, utilitarian model of justice, as opposed to a justice based on the dignity of work. And actually pursuing that welfarist model masks prophetic justice, because the more efficient we become at the service provider type of charity, the less likely it is that people will see the problem with the economy. That'd be the first sin. The second sin is about encouraging dependency. Again, inadvertently, sometimes the service-client dynamic in Christian charity encourages dependency and entitlement. It puts a person in need as a passive recipient, a supplicant role, and puts them in a transactional dynamic. So the benevolent giver is giving and they are receiving, and it's not really a relationship of reciprocity, which is really what we're looking for if we're looking for a relational justice. And it undermines solidarity, because what poor people really want is a job to support their own family. They want the dignity of being able to support their own family. I know someone who puts it very crudely, and he says the church has become a woke food bank. What we really need is decent work so we can make a life. Sorry? And a decent wage. And a decent wage. Well, dignity of work implies decent conditions and a decent wage. But as we said, the economy is a low-wage economy. That's something, by the way, that international finance lobbies government to deliver. They actually lobby government to keep wages low. And that's one of the reasons for mass migration over the years. We can all have different opinions about that. And I'd rather not take any racialized position on this. I think it's actually an economic issue that successive governments of all parties have presided over this in order to keep wages low. And it's destroyed the social peace. The third sin I wanted to draw attention to in terms of the effects of this period on the church is to do with secularization, the disconnect with faith. So a lot of Christian charities are becoming a little shy about being Christian. Perhaps they're worried they won't get funding, or perhaps they think it's not cool anymore, or they just want to make the language on their website a bit more accessible, a bit more inclusive, so they dumb down the Christian side of it. So faith fades sometimes due to a lack of confidence or fear of what funders might do or think, or sometimes the original Christian charism that lies behind a charity or a charitable initiative kind of fades, or it gets fossilized when its founding inspiration isn't fostered, when it's neglected. For example, you might have a charity, a wonderful idea at the beginning, and then over time the trustees change. The CEO is now somebody who's very efficient and professional in the NGO world, but he or she is not a Christian, and so the values have changed. And this can happen very imperceptibly over time. So this can compromise Christian distinctiveness to the extent that much of Christianity then becomes indistinguishable from a secular NGO. And we hear the government say, aren't you wonderful, aren't you useful? And local government offers us money. And we think, we feel flattered, isn't it great? But actually, if we're not also critiquing the system, we could be enabling the problem. I'm not saying we should stop doing charity. It's essential. But we have to be prophetic too and avoid being a handmaid to the state. Obviously, there are some other elements that the impact of this period has had on the church in terms of moral leadership. There are some great anger, actually, particularly with the C of E, among some working class communities who are particularly animated about, say, the grooming gang scandal. The church has said nothing about it. There's only one bishop, as far as I know, who said anything, which is Philip North, and even he apologised for it being so late. So there's been a kind of abrogation of moral leadership, which really makes people angry and actually drives them away from the church. Of course, the Catholic Church has also had its faults with child abuse, and again, drives people away from the church. But now, this new era, we've got a whole lot of new things happening. We've got this bigger backdrop of geopolitical volatility. Again, the end of the liberal project, the Tony Blair type of it, let's export, democratic liberalism around the world. Other countries just don't want this. They never wanted it. They're angry about it. And the whole dynamics have changed. So that's in the backdrop. We have at home and domestically very dysfunctional government, very volatile. We're facing this new industrial revolution that's coming. We're seeing this sort of spiritual confusion. Interesting, among this, we're seeing the signs of what some people call the quiet revival and what some people are calling the dirty revival. So you've got, some middle-class people being attracted to the more traditional forms of church, maybe Orthodox or Catholic, perhaps because they're fed up with being in a sea of meaninglessness and they're looking for something solid to attach to and finding some meaning through that. And then you've got some working class, maybe underclass communities who are so angry with everything, but they're looking for identity. And they're saying the churches have not delivered on their moral leadership. We want that back somehow. And so it may look coarse, it may look rough, but there's a certain type of revival going on there as well. That's why it's called the dirty revival. Alongside this, we're seeing actually the political space becoming more religious, not less. We're seeing in insurgent Muslim political movements, we're seeing Hindu movements, we're seeing various different types of Christianity pressing through, starting to be expressed. So it's becoming a very contested landscape. So in this space, how are we supposed to respond? Now, the reason I set out the Catholic social teaching principles at the beginning is because I think we really need a strong conception of an integrated faith that doesn't shy away from the realities of the world, which is based on a solid, deep theological tradition, and which is non-partisan. Now, the Catholic tradition is radical and conservative. You know, it asserts the family, it asserts belonging to place, but it also asserts intervention in the economy. It doesn't support the freedom of movement of capital, for example. It recognises the danger that that can have. So it's not predictable. It doesn't map along the lines of the standard left-right axis. So we need a Christianity that embodies solidarity, subsidiarity, the common good, the kinds of church engagement that we were talking about, that civic engagement. And I think we have to recognise the cavalry is not coming over the hill. We can't expect government anymore to adequately provide. Certainly not for a while anyway. We're in a very volatile period. So actually, what do we do at the grassroots level? Now, if we understand that the problem, which we diagnosed earlier in terms of hyperliberalism, is effectively individualism. The problem is individualism. How do we counter that? It's not that hard. It's hard work, but it's not complicated. It's about building relationships. It's about intentionally building local relationships. So I think we can see that in the example of Sheppard Worlock, Manning and Booth, that we have church leaders determined to build civic relationships for the benefit of the city, of the people. And we have to be very careful about not being tribal. We should build broad-based alliances with our neighbours. This is the intermediary institutions part of the framework, is that we should build relationships with our neighbouring institutions. So the church should be outward-facing. Who do we know? Do we know the pizza restaurant? Do we know the business? Do we know the tenants association? What relationships do we? So we're not just serving our own. We're not just focusing in on this lovely space, but we're an outward-facing people. A Jeremiah 29:7, if you like, seek the peace of the city type of people. And we should be resisting the identity politics that divides. We should be talking more about solidarity than diversity. How can we work together? How do we find common cause with each other, even if we disagree on certain things? And speaking the truth. Speaking the truth is very important in this era. There's too much self-censorship going on. I think we all know that sense, don't we, that sometimes we're like, well, I can't say that, what will happen? You know, maybe I'll keep quiet about that. Well, I'd say next time you feel that, if you feel that prick in your conscience, I think you should speak. At least inject a note of doubt. So this antidote really is relationship. And there's something about building friendship in a proactive, conscious, intentional way. For example, if you see a group that's vibrant and alive, that's a good thing, that's a beautiful thing. That's we were talking earlier about the common good being what happens between people, where they create a sense of mutual flourishing. If you see that, encourage it, support it, enable it to grow, connect them with another group. So you get this kind of reweaving, this sense of that thick layer becomes richer. So I'm going to stop there, but I hope I've given you a sense of where we are, what we can do. We can go into more detail in the discussion, but looking back at the Sheppard Worlock story, they were of their time, and they were very inspiring, but it's not all transferable for now. But anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope that's been helpful.
20,000 people with fairly strong churches. We do have 8 or 10 churches here which work together pretty well, as you will have seen, I think. And I can't ask you to know Horsforth more than that, but there's a start. How should we go about restoring relationships, building all the things that you're talking about, and trying to make this a great town for folk to live in?
Okay, well, take a couple of things to start with. One could be an approach in terms of reaching out to business, reaching out to potential investors, and having a deliberate attempt to create local jobs. Now that might seem impossible, it might seem pie in the sky, but there will be people with entrepreneurial ability among you. And if it's not an objective, it won't happen. So put that alongside your social action. Imagine you're all doing lots of charitable work. So in parallel with that, let's say, in every social action initiative that you're running, have a little team meeting and say, how can we make this more relational? So for example, if you're running a homeless shelter, could you offer your guests an opportunity to help clean up, to help, perhaps to volunteer, to offer them some purchase in terms of agency, so they're not always a recipient. So always a route back to becoming more human. Also, I would suggest that in terms of your relationship with the neighbourhood, rather than thinking about how do we get people into church, you position yourself in the neighbourhood, or both and. I'm thinking of a pastor I know, for example, in Croydon, South London, who was a Baptist pastor, and his congregation wasn't growing. It was about 40, ageing demographic, felt like a failure. My ministry hasn't really worked. And he felt the Holy Spirit calling him to go and talk to people in the neighbourhood. So what he did was he asked 6 people who he kind of knew in the neighbourhood, were not part of the church. He said, would you join me for a meal on Thursday night? It's not church, but it's sort of. And they said, well, what would that involve? He said, well, we'll cook together and we'll have a meal together. They said, okay. And so they decided together what they would make. They'd make a roast chicken dinner. They cooked it together and they sat around the table. And he shared one line from the Beatitudes, that's all. There was no preaching, just one line as a conversation starter. And he said it was the most amazing conversation. And it taught him something very profound, that the Holy Spirit is working in the neighbourhood, not just in the church. And they said, can we do this again next week? So they did it again. Anyway, over a period of months, it grew from 6 to 150 over 6 months. Because they said, can we bring our family? Can I bring my neighbour? So obviously the cooking had to change. They had to move into the church hall. But the point is, it was offering a form of worship. It became more religious as time went on. They were like, why are you like this? Why do you do this? And then he's able to share his story. Eventually it led to some baptisms and funerals and so on and so forth. But it remained a sense of an ownership, sort of co-ownership. So that's just one story. But I think it's about being listening to the Holy Spirit and asking how God is calling you. So I wouldn't sit down and strategize. I would sit down with a passage of scripture and dwell in it together and say, what is God calling us to do in this place? And like I said earlier, if you spot something with energy, you may not have to do the same thing. You could just support them. And it doesn't all have to be churchy stuff. I think this is the idea is that God is working among everyone in the city. But so that's a very simple way of approaching it. But I co-host a podcast which you might find helpful. It's called Leaving Egypt. So being God's people in times of unravelling, and we talk about these kinds of things, and we get on great guests with stuff they're doing on the ground. So just a flavour.
Anyone else got a question? I'm sure someone does. Ryan.
Thank you so much for your analysis of where we are and what's been happening and your lovely journey to get here. I'm just reminded by two bits of information I've had recently which kind of fit in with what you're saying. One was the Reef Lectures last year. Rutger Bregman, the Dutch historian, fantastic analysis of a lot of things that are going on. But the particular thing he called those series last year was the need for a moral revolution in our societies. And he references small groups of people in history who have done fantastic things, and he references the abolition of slavery, the prohibition in America and so on. So that's there. The other thing was in Leeds we have the Hook Lectures run by the Church Institute in Leeds. Last October, I think it was, we had John Curt from Social Hope into Action. Now again, there is similar analysis there about how it's not very helpful for Christian organisation to keep handing out, and how we need to have some reciprocity, like relational reciprocity. So it's really interesting what you're saying there and where you're coming from. And I'm just trying to think how we can build in that reciprocity in some of the things we can do. For instance, one thing we do is we have the farmers' market here, which is started by churches together. And we know quite a lot of people in Horsforth through simply being there. And I don't know whether it's an abusive term or not, but there's a talk now about parasocial relationships, where you know people, not closely, but you see them every so often because they come to the market. And there we have a very good opportunity for our churches to say what we are and aren't doing and so on. But we need to think perhaps of other things as well.
Okay, so just on the moral revolution and small groups, Pope Benedict spoke some time ago about the idea of the creative minority, as opposed to trying to start a mass movement, which is very difficult, right? But the creative minority, great change can happen with a small number of people, especially if they are fueled by the Holy Spirit. So if they are praying together and focused in a particular way, then great change can happen. And John Curt is a great friend of mine, and I'm working with him. In fact, that's an example of institutions working together. So I spoke earlier about this intentional reaching out to other institutions. So I reached out, John actually reached out to me, having heard me speak, and he said, a lot of what you're saying, not heard before, but it also really matches with what I think. So we started corresponding, and then I said, actually I've been looking for someone to do a lecture for me, because I hold public lectures from time to time on the future of Christian social action. So I commissioned him to do a lecture 2 years ago. And so he and I have been working together. And one of the lovely things is he's an evangelical and I'm a Catholic. So again, that's sort of echoing the joint leadership. And people appreciate that. People have come to us and said, we really appreciate you doing this together. And so we share things, but we have different practices, different doctrines, but we are intentionally working across difference, right? What was the last thing you mentioned?
I mentioned about John Kurt's Hope into Action charity.
Yeah.
Which is about how project that they do with.
Yeah, so that's an example of a charity that's really focused on not allowing dependency to develop. So he told me one story, for example, a homeless woman he'd helped years ago. He met up with her subsequently, and she said, the best thing you ever did for me was to evict me. She said, I needed that kick up the backside. I need some reality. So he talks about grace and truth. So I think the other thing you were talking about was moral leadership from the Reef Lectures, right? So part of moral leadership is being able to name right and wrong. And the problem with the neoliberal period is it has affected some of the churches who are getting a bit wishy-washy. You know, it has affected people because you don't want to offend people by, offending their personal preferences. But the church is meant to stand for something. And that the evidence is now that Gen Z is looking for tradition. They're looking for something that's clear. They're absolutely floundering in a sea of meaninglessness where everything is of the same value. It isn't actually true. Not all ideas are the same. So there's a call for a more confident, what Newbigin called a proper confidence in our tradition, but at the same time not triumphalist, at the same time not theocratic, at the same time not dominating. You know, it's got to have a generosity, a capaciousness about a kind of Christianity that welcomes everyone and yet is able to tell the truth.
Thank you. Time is nearly there, so there might be a couple of people who've just got a question they would love to ask, which we might have to leave a bit hanging, or a comment they'd just like to make. Is there anyone who'd like to throw a question out that, or leave us with a comment?
Yeah, well, thank you. You covered a hell of a lot of ground tonight, and it resonated deeply with, I think, a lot of us here. So my question is very simply, are you writing a book?
Oh, so many people keep asking me that question. No, I'm not, but I feel I should. But if I did, I'd stop everything else. And I haven't told you like what our work consists of. So I don't want to take up too much time, but there's some postcards at the back on the table before you go out. Do take a postcard and have a look at our site. And you know Joe, so Joe runs our schools works. We have this programme called Common Good Schools for 11 to 16s, and we just launched a programme for primary children. And that's a wonderful programme, and you can get involved in that if you're attached to a school. Also, the podcast I mentioned is called Leaving Egypt, new episode every 2 weeks. It operates really as a resource. It will resource you. Also, from time to time, I hold these public talks. So the next one is on May the 20th on AI and the future of work, and I've got a really great speaker coming over to do that. And in October, I've got one that's addressing the Christian nationalism issue among sort of working class poor communities. So that may be of interest to you too. So there's lots of resources on our website and our various social platforms. So I just wanted to make sure that you know what we do. Sorry, you had a point.
Yeah, I was just interested in your thoughts on how best can Christians and the wider society work well with Muslims, because there is tension.
So this is we're just starting this at 9 minutes. So it's like, this is a genuinely difficult problem, and I honestly think that the interfaith movement has not served us well enough. It has not, because it's not challenged the elephant in the room, which is that violent Islamism is real and it's a massive problem. And we've got to be honest about this. And one of the few good things about this Labour government is Shabana Mahmood. She at least is able to name the problem. And as a devout Muslim woman herself, very unusual, she's not married, she lives like a nun, she's really serious, devout Muslim. And she says, this is a problem, it's a broken system, it's actually causing real trouble for people like me, she said, people in my community, because we're allowing Islamism to run riot. You know, so it's got really out of control because of this political correctness that people have not been courageous enough to name. So that's naming the problem is one part of it, and not being cowed by threats of Islamophobia and racism, which is obviously a massive deal. It requires a lot of courage to face that down. But at the same time, I think making friendships with Muslims who are willing to have that friendship, but making sure it's an honest friendship. So it's not just sharing an iftar, it's not just having nice meals together, but you can actually have an honest conversation. So what do we agree on? What don't we agree on? Because honestly, I think Muslim women who are stuck at home are probably the most oppressed people in the country. And we're not allowed to say it. You know, so I think it's a combination of friendship and honesty. But don't underestimate how difficult this is. And it does require political action. This cannot be sorted by candles and vigils after a violent incident. That just makes people more and more angry because it looks like denial. And we have to have a proper proper, deep inquiry into the rape gang scandal. If that, it's like a poison in the body politic. If that's not properly investigated, we will just we'll be festering more and more anger. And I think people really underestimate how dangerous that is. So it's probably one of the greatest challenges of our time, and it requires some brave people. There are some brave people already, so take courage from those who are speaking. As I say, Bishop Philip North, Bishop of Blackburn, was the only bishop, as far as I know, may be wrong, who has said anything. And even he was apologetic that it was too late. So if we want to live well with our Muslim neighbours, we've got to identify that there's a cohort among them who are causing mayhem and making life difficult for them too. And of course they are under threat of violence and death and so on if they challenge their own tradition. So, yeah, I can't give you an easy answer, but I think telling the truth is the first step.
Can we give Jenny another big round of applause? Let me pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to think. Thank you for this time to look at things and explore what's going on and wrestle with how we should respond as those called to love our neighbour, those called to be salt in the world, light of the world. Lord, we pray that your Spirit may go with each one of us, and that you would be illuminating the things which we need to focus on, to reflect on, to wrestle further with. So I pray your blessing on each and every one of us in this room, Lord. Amen.